Welcome back, Australian history students. Well, this week we're going to look at the war in Vietnam, but let's first look at the origins and where it all began. The Vietnam War can be considered as a proxy war in the Cold War situation. What we mean by this is the key players, namely the Soviet Union and the United States, did not directly go to war against each other. They each supported a different side of the war. The Viet Cong were Vietnamese rebels in the south who fought against the southern Vietnam government and the United States. In the north, the supporters of Ho Chi Minh were supported by support from the communist USSR. Now let's briefly look at the origins of the conflict. As I mentioned before, the key players behind it, namely the United States and Russia, did have a key role in either side of the operation. Back in 1945, Vietnam declared their independence from France. Now, France had occupied Vietnam prior to that and held Vietnam as a colony of France. With the occupation of Japan during the Second World War, the French actually withdrew, leaving the Vietnamese to their own devices. Now, Ho Chi Minh led a communist revolt to fight France after the war, and his supporters were called the Viet Minh. The French refused to accept Vietnamese independence, and the two were soon at war. America threw its support and money behind France, hoping to help contain communism. Fighting between the French and the Viet Minh continued for almost 8 years. However, in 1954, the Viet Minh defeated the French at Dien Bien Phu after 56 days of battle. This battle ended French support for the war and a settlement was reached. French control over Vietnam was over. Now, for a brief time, Vietnam was now an independent nation. However, with the support of the Americas, the Southern Democratic Vietnam was starting to take up arms against the communist-led North Vietnamese Viet Minh. Now we're going to focus on how Australia became involved in the war in Vietnam. Australian support for South Vietnam in the early 1960s was in keeping with the policies of other nations to stem the spread of communism in Europe and Asia. Now, we could see that the support that the North was given through Ho Chi Minh was to take over the South and unite the entire country. So, in fact, this was a civil war. However, with the support in the South, with the intervention of the Americans, this war escalated into much a greater event than just a civil war. In 1962, Prime Minister Robert Menzies sent 30 Australian military advisors to Vietnam to help train the South Vietnamese army. In November 1964, the Commonwealth Parliament reintroduced compulsory military service, the National Service Scheme, which we will be talking about later. By early 1965, due to South Vietnam's inability to resist communist insurgents from the north, the USA commenced a major escalation of the war. By the end of that year, the US had committed 200,000 troops to the conflict and had asked its allies to similarly make commitments. Australia obviously responded earlier on with 30 military advisors who arrived in South Vietnam on July 1962. This was the beginning of Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War. Now, with Australia's involvement in the war in Vietnam, they were based in an area around the southern part of Vietnam. One of the major battles that did take place between the Viet Cong, the South Vietnamese insurgents, and the Australians took place at a location called Long Tan. The deadliest battle for Australian troops was this Battle of Long Tan on August the 18th, 1966. Around 100 Australian and New Zealand soldiers found themselves fighting a giant force of around 2,000 Viet Cong and experienced North Vietnamese army. Pinned down, low on ammunition and at risk of being surrounded, the Australian troops looked like they wouldn't survive the night. But they did, holding off the enemy until reinforcements arrived. You will be covering more of this in our lessons during the week. Now the year is 1968, and 1968 began with a major offensive by the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army, launched during the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, known as Tet. Not only the timing, but the scale of the offensive came as a complete surprise, taking in cities, towns and military installations throughout South Vietnam. For Australian troops, the effects of the offensive were felt around their base at Nui Dat, where a Viet Cong attack on targets around Ba Ria, the provincial capital, were repulsed with few casualties. The war in Vietnam dragged on for many years after the events of Long Tan and Tet, and when they did finally end, it was because Australia had won their part in the involvement. In the early 1970s, the US and Australian decided to pull out as public opinion turned against the war, and by 1975, the North had claimed victory over the South. Now, to sum up our lesson on Vietnam, let's have a look. From the time of the arrival of the first members of the team, the Australian team in 1962, almost 60,000 Australians, including ground troops and Air Force and Navy personnel, served in Vietnam. And with the withdrawal in 1973, we saw the significance of the battle, Australia's longest serving period of time in combat. This involvement of some 11 years saw the war that caused probably the greatest cause of social and political dissent in Australia. Many draft resistors, conscientious objectors and protesters were fined or jailed. And while some soldiers met hostile reception on their return home, the question or the battle of Australia involvement in Vietnam has lasted as an indelible part of our history. Just to sum up, to give you some statistics, 521 members of the Australian forces died as a result of the war, and over 3,000 were wounded. We will be looking at these casualties in a later chapter in our history of Vietnam and Australia's involvement.